Hey guys, it's yours truly, Mr. Andrews, coming to you live from my office. I wanted to give you a quick introduction for those of you who missed the live Zoom session today to Unit 3 and a quick preview of what our updated calendar looks like going forward. So, first thing to know about Unit 3 is that Unit 3 is really where we get the most theoretical. It's also where we get the biggest in terms of the bigger picture. If you think about Unit 1, we started really small and detailed, right? Right at the ground level, looking line by line at poetry and thinking about what the individual words and phrases really meant in context. And then from there, we sort of expanded out, right? Looking at a larger genre of journey and thinking about what is the pattern between stories that makes up this sort of genre and convention of a journey in literature. And then with this last one, we're expanding even further out by looking at what are some larger perspectives that we can think about literature overall through. If you want to think about it almost the way you talked about in 131, this is the unit where we're going to look at various perspectives or lenses for thinking about our world, and we're going to apply those to literature. So Unit 3 is literature in various contexts, and it's really an introduction to what we call critical theory. Now, what is critical theory? Well, first off, it doesn't just apply to literature. It's sometimes called literary theory, but I don't want to call it that because critical theory is really more than just about literature. It's a way of reading literature for sure, but it's also a way of thinking about the world. Critical theory is also applied to looking at real world issues as well, right? It's a lens through which we might look at a different issue. For instance, if we wanted to look at affirmative action, we could look at it through the lens of thinking about class or history or gender or race. There's a lot of different ways to think about a singular issue, right? So it's not necessarily about picking a superior or correct theory. We're not trying to pick like, oh, this theory is right and that theory is wrong. You want to think about these more as these are just different dimensions of an issue, right? Just like you've got this flat dimension, this curved dimension, and this spherical dimension. These are just like spatial ways of thinking about any issue. Any object has several different dimensions, right? That it has like mathematically. But the same thing is for any issue in the world as well. There's a lot of different angles or perspectives we could look at the issue from. And all of them just add new layers of meaning to a thing. And likewise, when we look at a story, there's a lot of layers of meaning in a story. These perspectives, these theories just help us to focus on one of them, right? So we're going to examine particular human constructs through this. Now, what is a construct? A construct is something that is made up, right? If you think about it this way, if you go into the jungle, tigers aren't exactly exchanging currency to buy meat. They just go grab it, right? A construct then would be something like money, where I hand somebody a piece of paper to give me a necessity for living, right? That is something we agree upon. It's like a social contract. And think about another one, like if I sneeze, you're going to say, God bless you, Gesundheit, something like that, right? That's a human construct. That's just like nobody says you have to do that, but that's kind of a rule and a convention, right? There are other constructs out there though, and a lot of them have to do with identity. Think about ethnicity, race, sexuality, and gender, right? Those are all things that we're finding out seem to be, for some people, very fixed, and for other people, very fluid. And a lot of it has to do with your beliefs, suggesting that it's not necessarily just a natural thing. And that's the great debate, right? Is it natural or is it constructed? Critical theory tries to look at these things as, are these constructs, and how do we think about them? So they can reveal layers of meaning in the world and how we believe and think and assume about things. So what are some major questions that we're going to explore in this unit? There are a lot of different critical theories out there. We're only going to look at a few of them, though. I want you to know this is the tip of the iceberg. But some of the major questions that are examined by critical theory that we're going to look at here involve how do conventions and mediums affect the message? So think about the last time you watched a Harry Potter movie, and how did that compare to the experience of reading the book? Right? The medium can sometimes change the message and the way that it comes across, right? So genre theory is one way of looking at and examining specifically how does writing a horror story or retelling a story as a horror story affect the way that maybe the message came across or affect the story itself. Some of you may be familiar with Pride and Prejudice with zombies, right? That's like a zombified version of Pride and Prejudice. How did writing it through that lens, right, change the way it looked at? So genre theory focuses on just that, understanding how mediums like film versus story, affect the way that messages come across. Another lens we're going to look at is what's called New Historicism. New Historicism is one you're familiar with. It's where you really look at the historical context for something. When did it happen? What was happening at the time when it was written? When you looked at Great Gatsby or The Crucible, you were probably thinking about and even reading some examples of historical things that were happening at the time, things that were influencing the ideas, the values, and beliefs espoused by the text or espoused by its author. Also, there's gender theory and LGBTQ studies, right? This is where we examine what assumptions and identities about gender and sexuality exist, right? So a story doesn't have to be about gender for us to look at this, though. Think about, for instance, looking at Song of Solomon. Was it really about gender? A lot of you in class today were talking about how it was a coming-of-age story. It was about race. It was about family identity. But there are a lot of details we could look at in the story where we can focus on what are some of the assumptions the characters make about gender? What are some of the assumptions they make about sexuality? And what are the impacts of those assumptions that we see playing out in the story? This is a way of applying that theory. Another one is to focus more on class and wealth. That's what we would call Marxist or socioeconomic theory. It's when we focus on, as we read through literature, on class and wealth and power. And what does the story suggest about how class, wealth, and power function in our world, right? So again, this isn't just about literature, though, because real life inspires fiction, right? A lot of the ideas, we know what we know, and we write about what we know. So what does literature, when we read through it, right, suggest about the nature of class, the nature of what it means to be wealthy, and how that interacts with power? Last but not least, this one has to do with race and ethnicity, right? How is race and ethnicity interpreted? In other words, what do people seem to believe or assume about race? And how does it interact with one's class? How does race and ethnicity impact one's history and one's culture? This is what we would call post-colonial or cultural studies. Right now, post-colonial comes from an examination of looking at colonies. Like think about South Africa or India. These are countries that were taken over by a country in power, right? Not the native culture, and then a native culture. And oftentimes there were differences, significant ones, right? Maybe language or culture or values. And that power dynamic, right, becomes really interesting when you think about a country that comes in and says, you're all going to speak English now, right? So this also suggests something about the relationship between race and class or culture. Or power. And so that's why a lot of post-colonial theory focuses on those areas specifically, because that's where we can learn a lot about race and ethnicity and how they're interpreted and what other areas of life they impact. So that said, those are some of the major questions we're going to be focusing on in this unit. But I want to show you one more thing as we wrap up this quick overview today. And that involves our calendar. So if you go to our Canvas site, you will see the updated calendar is still up at the top. But if you go into that updated calendar, it will no longer just have everything up to spring break. It actually goes through the end of the year now, starting today. So today we're just doing an introduction, right? But you'll see that on each subsequent date, you have an assignment that is due on that date. So I want you to know that when you see Chang's The Great Silence, that's a story that you're going to read for next time, on the 15th, that means you should have read it by the 15th. Now, for each one of these classes through the 29th, we are going to spend each class doing a live Zoom discussion session. Now, it's worth noting that these discussion sessions will be no longer than a half hour. They'll be very focused, and I will always post in advance some of the primary questions I'm going to ask. Now, here's the reason why. Each one of these classes is going to involve 5 participation points. And in order to get those participation points, you need to be a part of the live Zoom session, and you need to make sure that you're getting involved, okay? Now, there will be opportunities to make some of these up by written discussion if you have a legit reason for missing. But honestly, it's going to be the easiest for you and for me and for all of us for you to get your participation points by simply attending the live Zoom sessions. So live Zoom sessions will continue to take place at 1 o'clock for G1 and 2 o'clock for G4. That said, we will be looking at next time genre theory. We're going to look at specifically one part of genre theory, which focuses on how mediums change the message. How do you adapt a story between mediums? So think about Harry Potter the movie versus Harry Potter the book. If we're looking at that in this case, we're going to be looking at a story called by Chang, called The Great Silence. On page 11 in your books, it's a short story, but you'll see that there's also a film version of it that I'm linking from YouTube as well. You're going to watch both of them. And as you're watching them, as you're watching the film version, I want you to make some mental comparisons here between the story that you read and the film version itself. And note some of the questions that I'm posting for that. I will be putting that out in an announcement today. We're also going to look at gender, right? We're going to re-examine Joyce Carol Oates, who wrote Mastiff. You may remember that. We're going to make some comparisons between what does she seem to be saying in Mastiff versus what is she saying in this story. We're also going to look at a really funny story called St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves and explore what are some of the things that it's suggesting about norms around gender in that story as well. We're also going to examine New Historicism by looking at a historically situated story called Battle Royal, and also looking at a historical document that bared some influence at the time on it and make some comparisons there. We'll also be exploring races at this time as well. We're also going to spend the last two classes in looking at socioeconomic issues. So that is culture and also class and power, right? Two stories, Simplica Girls Diaries and The Bullshit Job Boom there. And then we're going to spend the remainder of class, as you can see, focusing on drafting our last major paper. There are no more micro themes. That is it. And we'll be finishing by the 15th. Which will be about a week before class really technically ends, but I need that time in order to grade your last papers. We will have our last class on the 19th. On that day, we will have a little bit of a class reflection. That'll be a live Zoom session, voluntary, of course, for us to sort of like just take some time and enjoy each other for one last time. Guys, if you have any questions, reach out to me, but look for an announcement today. I'm going to send it out right after this with instructions for next class, and I wish you well.